think you can go ahead. So good morning, everyone. I'm Frampton Tolbert, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council, and very excited to welcome everyone this morning to Preserving Affordability, using historic preservation to develop and maintain affordable housing. This is a really exciting half-day symposium that we're holding for architects, developers, preservationists, and other practitioners to take an in-depth look at successful examples where historic buildings have been rehabilitated for new affordable housing. And in New York right now, housing dominates many of our conversations we're having. So it's imperative as a community that we demonstrate how preservation is supporting goals around affordable housing, sustainability, and equity. And I hope this will just be the first of a series of programs that help demonstrate this. So I'd really love to thank all the participants who agreed to lend their expertise today. I'd like to give a big thank you to HDC's co-host, Pratt Institute's Historic Preservation Graduate Program, and our steering committee who helped put this together, Vicki Weiner, Chris Cirillo, Ward Dennis, and John Shapiro. And additional thanks to panelist Al Shahadi, who helped put in work on this as well. You'll be hearing from all of them today. I also want to, sorry, hold on a second. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for their support and promotion of this event. We appreciate your generosity: AIA Historic Building Committee, AIA Brooklyn, Higgins and Quasebarth, and HDC's Board President, John Bacon. A few housekeeping items before I wrap up. For those of you who are requesting AIA Health, Safety, Welfare, Continuing Education credits, if you have not yet provided your AIA number to HDC in the past day or so, please resend your name and number to us at hdc@hdc.org. As you can see, we were recording this program and it will be available to all attendees. We may offer some of this content more widely in the future, but we'll coordinate with our panelists beforehand. To see more about each panel, please, including the full bios on each panelist, we'll be putting a link to the program page in our chat so you can follow along during the day with the full bios. Finally, if you have any issues with presentations or technology or questions or comments, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Panelists and moderators will not necessarily be reviewing the chat, so please only use the Q&A for questions. And now I will pass it over to my colleague, Vicki Weiner, Academic Director of the Historic Preservation Graduate Program, to say a few words, and she'll introduce the moderator for our first panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Frampton. And hello, everybody. Welcome. It's really exciting to see this great group of folks who are here today to join the symposium. As Frampton mentioned, I am the director of the Historic Preservation Master's Degree Program at Pratt Institute. Our program has, since its founding, always been focused on the ways in which historic preservation and heritage conservation benefit communities, particularly low and moderate income communities. And so this issue that we're going to be addressing today of how historic preservation can be tapped and used to maintain and develop affordable housing here in New York City is near and dear to our hearts. And I want to thank all of our panelists who are joining us and presenting really expert experience and knowledge today. We're going to learn so much, and we really appreciate you. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this morning for the first panel, Christopher Cirillo. Chris is a graduate of the Historic Preservation Program at Pratt Institute. We're very proud of his accomplishments as an alum. He is now a visiting assistant professor in the Historic Preservation Program, as well as the Real Estate Practice Program at Pratt. Since 2012, Chris has been the executive director and president of Ascendant Neighborhood Development Corporation. This fantastic organization, which many of you know, is based in Harlem and has preserved and developed over 800 affordable rental apartments in northern Manhattan. And the organization currently has a remarkable 2,100 or so affordable rental apartments in its development and rehabilitation pipeline. And this is really a credit to Chris and his amazing staff and his board and his community partners. up in East Harlem. And I can't think of more capable hands to be handing off the first panel for today's symposium to. So Chris, I am delighted to pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Vicki, for that very nice introduction. And good morning, everyone. And thank you to HDC and to Pratt's Historic Preservation Program for sponsoring this event. I'm really excited to be participating and moderating the first panel. I'm excited to hear from our panelists who have had some of whom I've known for many years, and to have them share with you their work at the intersection of affordable housing and historic preservation. You have the link in the chat to their full bios, but I'm going to just give a brief overview of who our three panelists are, and then we'll turn it over to them to talk about two case studies and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers for our panelists. So first up, we're going to be hearing from Ward Dennis, who's a partner at Higgins Quasebarth Partners. Ward has an extensive background in architectural conservation, urban planning, and architectural history. His work at HQ centers on projects requiring government review at the federal, state, and local levels. And he has extensive experience on projects that marry historic preservation and affordable housing. In addition, I have the pleasure of working with Ward at Pratt, where he also serves as a visiting assistant professor in the historic preservation program. Next up, we'll hear from Christoph Stump, who is a registered architect and currently serves as vice president for design and construction at Trinity Financial, where he manages due diligence, permitting, and construction activities for Trinity's New York office. He and Ward will be talking about a project that they worked on together called Randolph Houses in northern Manhattan. And finally, we'll hear from Mark Zimet. Mark also has extensive experience in real estate development and affordable housing, and currently serves as director of development for Dunn Development, an organization that has a long history of working in New York City in the affordable housing and field. So I'm really excited to turn it over now to our panelists, and we're going to start with Ward. So let's get Ward's presentation called on.
So Ward, I've made you a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. You're on mute.
It actually should be Christoph who is sharing screen for this.
Great, I will make Christoph a co-host now. And Christoph, just let me know if that does not work.
Yep. Oh, it works. Hold on. Coming up.
What you see on the left and right is a collection of 36 old law tenements that were constructed in the mid 1890s. These were all speculatively constructed as middle-class housing, largely for families that were moving north from neighborhoods in lower Manhattan. The more recent history here is that the city acquired these buildings in the 1960s, and in 1966, NYCHA converted them to public housing, and they have been public housing since the mid 1960s. At the time NYCHA acquired them, they renovated all of the apartments at the interior, did a large amount of gut rehabs, but significantly, they maintained each of these buildings as an individual building with its own stoop and entry and its own interior stair circulation. Next, please. So keeping with the more recent history, in about 2000 or so, the buildings on the south side of the street, which you can see in this photo from about 2014 before the project started, these buildings were vacated due to serious deteriorating conditions, roof leaks, and a whole host of other issues. So the buildings were vacated, and NYCHA's proposal in the mid 2000s was to demolish all of the buildings and construct new affordable / public housing on the site. As part of the public review for that proposal, the New York State Historic Preservation Office, SHPO, which is an acronym you'll be hearing a lot today, They made a determination that these buildings were eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. And as a result of that determination, the demolition of the buildings was determined to be an adverse impact. NYCHA pivoted following that determination and decided that they would retain the buildings, avoid the adverse impact, and put them out for an RFP as rehabs. NYCHA retained architecture firm and others to develop plans for that rehab, and the proposal involved removing large sections of the rear of the buildings to create light and air, combining the buildings internally, removing all of the vertical circulation, and removing the history of them as individual buildings. SHPO was on board for that and determined that that would not be an adverse impact in terms of a compliance review. But in making that determination, SHPO was also very clear that that proposal would not qualify for the historic tax credits. Next, please. So Trinity, where Christoph works and our client on the project, went into the RFP under the prior NYCHA plan, won the RFP, but it was always their intention to see if they could use the historic tax credits and adapt the plan to qualify for the credits. And the value of the credits here was substantial. Between the federal and state credits, there's a 40% tax credit on qualified rehabilitation expenditures, basically all of the hard and soft costs on the project on a per building basis. So that was a very substantial financial incentive. Trinity was, it was committed to trying to make that happen, but it involved a lot of reworking of the pre-approved NYCHA plans in order to get them to align with the historic tax credit standards. Next, please. So going back to some of the more ancient history, there are 36 buildings here, but they were developed in, there were seven different developments done speculatively in the mid 1890s. The earliest ones, which you see shaded in purple on the north top side of the street here, is actually two developments from about 1895, probably done by the same architect. Brownstone faced tenements with low stoops. You can see the condition of the brownstone on the two right-hand photos. These were stylistically very Victorian era decoration and very typical for the period from the 1880s forward. Next, please. On the south side of the street, there were four different developments. The two that are highlighted here at the far east end of the street were also done 1896, also brownstone facades. You can see here the after photos, the substantial restoration that was done on these buildings. Next, please. And then the last two sets of buildings were only done a year later, but represent a complete stylistic sea change from the brownstone era to the post-Columbian exposition, lighter colors, classical revival, Beaux-Arts era. Interestingly, the buildings that we saw in the previous slide, the brownstone ones, some of those were designed by Neville and Badge architects, who then a year later designed one of these blocks of buildings in the Beaux-Arts style. And you can see the light colored brick, the limestone trim, and the limestone bases. And also, if you note on the right photo, there are these concrete brutalist stoops. These were installed by NYCHA in the 60s and are really one of the few unifying features throughout the whole complex of buildings. So next, please. The other unifying feature and really character defining feature of these buildings, in addition to their exterior architecture, is their interior layouts. Unlike local landmarks review, the tax credit review takes into account what's happening on the interior of the building and the exterior of the building. The real goal is to retain, restore as many of the character defining features as possible. And in the case of old law tenements, the character defining features are interior circulation patterns, and in particular, light wells and light courts of the very classic dumbbell plan. Next, please. Interestingly, each of the architects and each of the developers on these projects had a slightly different approach to the classic dumbbell plan. You can see here shaded in red the different light wells and light court configurations, and outlined in red you can see the location of the vertical circulation, the single stairs that go up through the building. In order to qualify for the tax credits, we needed to develop a plan that both allowed us to connect buildings laterally, but also retain all of the vertical circulation and as much of the light wells as possible. So you can see that if you're going to add a horizontal corridor in here, you're really threading the needle in some places. And that was one of the big challenges. Next, please. This plan here is NYCHA's concept plan from 2010. This is a plan that we did not do, but that NYCHA determined was compatible with standards for compliance review, but not a tax credit. And what you can see shaded in red here is the removal of large sections of the rear of the buildings, taking away the light courts and bringing in additional light and air, as well as outlined in red the new proposed interior circulation. All of the interior stairs in this proposal, and you can go next, please, Christoph. All of the historic interior stairs in these plans were removed. All of the building entries became at grade, not via the stoops, and new elevators were added throughout, and two means of egress were added throughout. As I mentioned, this level of intervention, particularly at the interior and removal of building area at the exterior, would not have met the tax credit standards. And this was the plan that then Trinity set about to modify to get to the tax credits. And this is the point that I will hand it over to Christoph to finish the story.
Thank you, Ward, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, so a lot of developers look at eligibility as kind of an obstacle to development. And as Ward pointed out, we looked for the opportunity here to raise additional equity for finance. What we did here is take the 36 old law tenements that NYCHA acquired and rehabilitated in the 70s. And we rehabilitated them again in the mid-2010s, 2013 through 2018 as a two-phase project. Ward has pointed out that the north side buildings of the street were occupied at the time of our intervention, and the buildings on the south side were vacant and in fact boarded up. So we did this development in two phases. First, the vacant south side, we combined each 11 tenements into one building. So it's two buildings total on the south side. And then on the north side, in a second phase, after relocation of the tenants, we turned 14 tenements into one building. You can see it's a mix of apartments that we ended up implementing, and it's largely public housing and low-income housing, tax credit housing, so LIHTC housing. It's a mix of these two. Accessing equity for the historic tax credits raised almost 26% of the total development costs here, and put out the sources. You can see there's a federal portion and a state portion. Together they made up over 26% of total development costs. So it was a significant funding source for this project. In order to access this equity and the historic tax credits, we went through a specific development approach, obviously. And I want to show this here. This is an ALTA survey, well, from before, but might as well be an ALTA survey from after the intervention. Looks the same. The footprints are all over the place, so I color-coded them a little bit for you to understand the, the different types of buildings that we have and how we combine these tenements into 3 buildings, buildings A, building B, and building C. And I want to go into a little more detail on building C and what I dotted here as the area of detail. So originally, we have the interior floor plan from the Department of Buildings record on the left side. That's the so-called I-card. I'm not sure if it stands for information card or something, from 1971. Building inspector went into these buildings and recorded that layout. So you can see the vertical circulation in purple is in the center. You see the 2 light courts to the side of the circulation, and then in the back you see the narrow courts. And the apartments in red and yellow are really shotgun apartments. So there's one room lined up after another. There's no interior corridor for the apartment. And it's just a line of room. Also, you may know this, but here I'll point this out. You see that the light wells are providing light and air to bedrooms, which is, was a way at that time to get legal light and air. On the right side, you see what NYCHA did with them. They very much modernized those apartments into, standard modern apartments at that time, more privacy. So the apartments actually turned into north and south rather than, or front and back, I should say, apartments rather than into long shotgun apartments. One consequence is here that now, at the time, the multiple dwelling law required 2 means of egress. So now that we have an apartment in the front and in the back, NYCHA had to add one of those fire escapes in the front of the building, ones that hadn't been there before. So now we have fire escapes on both sides. When we took those buildings, the big task in the RFP was making those apartments not only modernizing them, but making them accessible. And the big challenge that everybody was looking at was, how do you provide accessible vertical circulation? So you need an elevator. How do you do that efficiently? You do that with a central elevator, and you do that with a central corridor combining buildings. I think everyone looked at it in a very similar way. That's the only cost-effective way to do this. So on the right side, you see what we did with those layouts. We created a new corridor going east-west, here left-right, outside of the existing stairwells. And that had some implications for the apartments internally. We used the multiple dwelling law to develop those apartments, in part because we wanted to continue to use these light valves for legal light and air. And with the modern building code, you can't do that, right? You need 30 feet to the next building wall or lot line, or a street. So you can see here on the right side, you can see bedrooms that open up into these light wells. That was possible under the multiple dwelling law. Another consequence was that at the time the law was written, buildings of certain floor plates, especially when you combine buildings like this, they needed to have access to an egress that was a 2-hour fire-rated masonry partition. At that time, board, I guess wasn't really available or wasn't invented yet or not really used. So it was specifically called out as masonry. So we had to design our corridor in masonry instead of sheetrock. That was a impediment that we'll look at a little more. And then you see a new set of stairs. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. That's a new code compliant egress stair outside of the existing non-compliant stairs. Those were too narrow, and treads and riser heights wouldn't work, and all kinds of complications. So how did that look like? When we acquired the buildings, through this process, actually it's a ground lease, so we didn't really acquire, but when we started construction, that's one on the photo on the right side shows the state of the brownstone. A lot of the profiles were completely gone or much deteriorated. On the interior, this historic photo on the left side, and on the right 3 photos are from the state that the buildings were at the time. The photo all the way to the right is from a vacant building, obviously, and the 2 on the left, they were occupied at the time. So that was the north side. And the apartments, we don't have before photos, but they were also in various states of deterioration. Squatters were there. That's how we found them. And obviously we had to really take out the interior partitions for the new layouts, and a lot of the horizontal structure we had to take out. The joists were in very poor condition, so we put in all new joists. And now the complication with the corridor, remember the masonry walls. Well, 5 floors of masonry walls are very heavy, and we had to put in new foundations to carry that load. Now, if you have existing tenement buildings that are 25 foot wide, first you're breaking through with a new corridor here. This is the existing rubble wall in the basement. And then you have very confined spaces, and our foundations had to work with the existing. This is actually urban fill. This is not virgin soil, this is urban fill. So there was development on these sites prior to these buildings, apparently. And we had to use these helical piles with specialty equipment from Canada. It was very time consuming and difficult work. But once that work was in place, on the left side, you see the foundation for that corridor is in. It punches through the demising walls, and the masonry corridor walls are going up. Once that was in place, it was a relatively straightforward rehabilitation process. Put in your interiors, and then on the roof, we took out the corrugated metal bulkheads that Nitro had put in, and we had to rebuild the parapets. You see some of the light wells. So this is how it looked after the intervention. The bulkheads received skylights. And on the front facade, a lot of the profiles I mentioned earlier were really pretty much gone or in very poor condition. We had to basically take them off and replace them with profiles. We took the profiles before we took them, the old deteriorated profiles out. We took those profiles and then cast new cast stone profiles for all the profile work, not just the window surrounds, but there's also horizontal profiles of the facades. And then the brownstone flat panels between windows had to be repaired. A lot of the surface had to be taken off and refinished. New cornices. And here's some interior pictures after the intervention. So this is the corridor, the new central corridor going through the buildings. We retained those remnants of the demising walls to preserve that part of history. You can also see, interestingly, you have these handrails. Those are ramps because the buildings, because of street grading, are at different elevations, and we had to transition internally on height elevations. And then these are existing stairs that we rehabilitated. They are not in use because they are not code compliant, but we kept them in their original location. And here are some photos from the new apartments. You know, this may not have been a criteria from a historic standpoint, but what I also found interesting is the location of the light wells and the bedrooms. So now, you know, we preserve those bedrooms in those locations too. I mean, those views you don't get until you're really in a tenement building. And that was very, very interesting to me. That's a progression of, you know, old stair building, stair photo from the deterioration, then our new lobby with the elevators. That's now at a slightly different elevation because we had to change the grade to make these buildings accessible. So some exterior before and after shots. Some of the masonry was very much artistic, not just profiles and banding, but really, yeah, you have these faces, you have column capitals. So we had to take these columns out, take them to the shop, repair them, and some of them replace them. We had really an artist mason on this job. And here's another before and after. So we're talking a lot about buildings here, but one point I want to make at the end is this is not just about buildings, but we also we preserved the actual community in those buildings. Again, this is public housing, and we were very lucky to work together with the tenant association. You see on the top right a before photo, and they helped us in developing the program, the apartments, and they were front and center with us all through the process. And on the bottom right, you see the same tenant association now with red shirts, and it was really a very successful project. So it was a very gratifying process for me. With that, I want to thank and give it back to Chris. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ward and Christoph, for that overview. So we're going to turn next to Mark, who's going to talk about his project, the T building. And just a reminder, the Q&A, please start to drop any questions that you have about the projects as you're hearing these overviews. Please start to drop your questions in there so that when we get to the Q&A session in about 15 minutes, we will have your questions ready to go. So with that, Mark, please take it away and tell us about the T building.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, I'm Mark Zimet. I've been developing affordable and supportive housing in New York City for almost 30 years, the past 19 of them with Martin Dunn and Dunn Development Corp. Recently, my longtime coworker Maggie Poxon and I started our own firm, Fishplate Development, to work on creative, challenging projects like this one. So the T building is shorthand for the Triborough Hospital for Tuberculosis, a 243,000 square foot institution. It was built in 1939 on the campus of the Queens Hospital Center, owned by New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation. The building was designed, as you can see, with large windows, south-facing balconies, and multiple terraces to maximize light and air for patients with tuberculosis. So I'll start by scrolling through some of the Library of Congress photos of the building from the 1940s. So here you can note the 10-foot wide corridors and historic interior windows and door openings, both of which were required to be preserved by SHPO and the National Park Service. And you'll see how that turned out later. The large balcony windows and doors, the originals were replaced, but the locations were preserved as required, along with original historic ceiling heights, which also proved to be challenging. The full ribbon windows on the curved east and west ends of the building were incorporated into the end apartments. This is the historic 9th floor auditorium, which originally had a stage and a projection room. And that was actually a late preservation. The National Park Service, as part of their Part 2 requirement, sort of late in the game, insisted that this space be preserved in its original form. This is the historic first floor library, which was also preserved and restored and is now a library computer room for building residents. And the original basement kitchen for the facility has come full circle and is now community facility space with a large commercial kitchen for teaching cooking classes. So later you can see the after photos that correspond to these images. The T building's value was diminished beginning in the 1950s with the discovery of effective antibiotic treatments for tuberculosis and by the development of more modern buildings on the Queens Hospital campus. So over the decades, medical uses of the building were phased out, and by the time we got involved in the project, the building was almost entirely vacant. Its biggest benefit to the hospital at that point was the revenue from the multitude of movie and TV shoots on the site. And in addition to the film crews, the only regular occupants of the building were families of raccoons and falcons who filled the void and established residence. Dunn Development Corp was selected by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development and New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation in June of 2014 to redevelop the T building as supportive and affordable housing. We first walked the building in July 2014, and 5 years after that, the project closed on construction financing with Mega Contracting Group as the general contractor. Abatement and demolition started in July 2019 and ran through the pandemic. The building was substantially completed in April 2022. The T building now contains 200 units of low and moderate income affordable housing, including 75 units of formerly homeless single adults from the New York City shelter system and referrals from the Queens Hospital and other HHC campuses, with on-site services provided by CAMBA. Common Point Queens, a local nonprofit, opened a youth opportunity hub with commercial kitchen in the former T building kitchen. The nonprofit arts organization Chishama operates space in the basement for working artists who also teach programs for building residents. And as part of the acquisition terms, 12,000 square feet in the basement with natural light are used as office space for Queens Hospital Center employees. So this was a complicated $110 million total development cost project with a variety of funding sources, which you can see here. I'll highlight that the allocation of low-income housing credits from HPD was their largest single 9% allocation ever issued. Redstone Equities, with Bank of New York Mellon as the investor, was the syndicator for both the low-income and the historic credits. So as affordable housing developers, we're used to an alphabet soup of agencies and programs to work with and to mixing multiple public and private financing sources, but this was our first experience with historic tax credits. So the 18 million in equity from the federal and state historic credits provided around 16% of the overall funding, but it's a big number, and without that, we would not have been able to proceed with this project, or it would have required a lot more public subsidy from affordable housing, which is always scarce and hard to access. So as with all projects, but particularly buildings of this size and complexity, it took a dedicated team working for years to get this done. I'll quickly name check some key people and flip through some before photos of the building. Sakiakis, a longtime partner at SLC Architects, who we've worked with on many projects, was very familiar with this building, having drawn up multiple iterations of preservation, demolition, and new construction alternatives over the past 3 decades. Having no idea what we were getting into, we got excellent guidance from Mary Kay Judy and Carrie Culhane, the historic consultants who are collectively Virgil to our Dante, guiding us through the circles of historic requirements. The structural engineer, Don Friedman, was very helpful in identifying the structural systems used in the building and helping to translate that into demolition and restoration plans. Jim Dossett from RWDI provided excellent guidance on envelope treatment and waterproofing details. Stephen Winter Associates in Skyline Engineering helped adapt an old building to the modern era with energy efficiency and MEP design. And we also got important clarifying tax credit advice from our attorneys at Cannon, Hayman & Weiss. So this property was owned by the City of New York, and this project was really only possible because of the commitment of New York City Health and Hospitals and New York City HPD to converting the building to affordable and supportive housing. We were consistently impressed with the responsiveness and commitment of both the city agencies and of the staff at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. The folks at SHPO were very helpful and responsive, particularly for we who had not been through the process before. And most importantly, this project never would have happened without the financial and emotional commitment of my boss, Martin Dunn, and the years of hard work from my coworkers, Tiffany Price, and especially Maggie Poxon, who put her heart and soul into seeing this building through to completion. So I will end the before photos with the set of the Arkham Asylum from the TV show Gotham, one of the many shows and movies filmed at the site. The sets helped make every walkthrough of this empty hospital building uniquely terrifying in a why is that idiot opening that door kind of way from the horror movies. So as a brief highlight of the process we went through, the building was not already listed. So the first step was doing historic research to submit the T building on the National Register of Historic Places. After the listing was successful, the historic consultants prepared the Part 1 and 6 months later submitted a far more detailed Part 2 filing to SHPO and the National Park Service. The historic consultant, structural engineer, and architect, along with the MEP engineer and landscape civil architects, prepared voluminous sets of plans for multiple layers of review by DOB and HPD. We thought those plans would be sufficient for Part 2, but quickly realized that that set has its own specific requirements and unique priorities, adding some time and complication to the design process. The Part 2 included an extensive narrative scope of work, much of which was incorporated in the architect's plans and specifications and in the contract documents with the GC, outlining and specifying the historic components that had to be preserved and the work that needed to be done to restore them. At the same time, we were going through a thorough design review process with New York City HPD, which dictates apartment layouts in minute detail and which tries to maximize the number of units and minimize the amount of public subsidy minimize the amount of extraneous common areas in order to reduce public subsidies for affordable housing, which, as I said, are rare and hard to come by increasingly. Overall, the building design was a constant balancing act between HPD, DOB, and the historic requirements of SHPO and the National Park Service, particularly on specific historic items that matter to them, like maintaining the historic 10-foot wide corridor. So here you can see an example from the plans where the architect's original design had reduced the center double-loaded corridor from the historic 10-foot width to 5 feet, which is typical in our new construction affordable housing, giving a few more feet of space to the units on either side. So SHPO pushed back on that hard from the beginning on maintaining the original corridor width as an essential component. And so we ended up with a somewhat compromised solution of keeping the bulk of the historic corridor at 10 feet and tapering off to 5 feet at the narrower wings at the ends of the building, which did not historically have corridors. As another example of historic-driven design changes, very late in the process, the National Park Service decreed that the original 9th floor auditorium had to be maintained in its historic form. For HPD, we were maximizing units, so it counted on 2 apartments in that space, but ended up dropping them and revising the budget with 2 fewer units in order to comply with SHPO and the National Park Service. During the design process, we worked extensively with the general contractor, Mega Contracting, to get their feedback and to keep them in the loop on historic and other details. So this was definitely a negotiated price job, not a bid job. Given the complexities involved, it would have been very challenging to bid the job because we just didn't have all the details in hand and things were constantly changing and being adjusted as needed. And it would have added months of time to the project. As with any gut rehab, but particularly a building of this size and scale, there were lots of surprises revealed during and after demolition. What we thought was a solid concrete subfloor was neither continuous nor consistent, requiring infill at the base of every terracotta wall removed, which you can see in part here. The steel columns were in remarkably good condition and the structure of the building itself, but we had to address a seemingly endless array of prior penetrations to by the hospital to the Schuster concrete and terracotta floor ceiling structure, which you can see here. It was a mix of terracotta and concrete in various areas. And so each of the holes that was poked in that, if it was damaging the structure, added additional concrete and steel beams to the ceiling. Despite doing numerous probes in various locations throughout pre-development, the existing roof deck conditions varied widely and prompted wholesale changes in roofing systems and approaches after demolition. And one final example, we discovered a water line feeding the building that was not on prior surveys and had no evident source or shutoff valves. So we tried for months to trace the line around campus with no success. We ended up having to live tap the pipe to cut in a valve while the line was still active. And importantly, Energy Code did not apply. New York City Energy Code did not apply to this job because of the National Register listing, which is an important factor in getting the building designed. But as the long-term owners and operators, we wanted to build in as much energy efficiency as we feasibly could. So we ended up adding insulation inside the perimeter walls and using a hybrid heat pump system that did not require wall penetrations for heating and cooling the apartments. We also convinced SHPO and the National Park Service that we absolutely had to replace the historic steel double hung windows, both for tenant comfort and for the economic viability of heating and cooling the building. So wrapping up, I'll toss in some conclusions and lessons learned to a backdrop of the photos of the completed building. The T building worked as a historic rehab first and foremost because the existing building is built to a higher density than the current zoning would allow. In other words, if we had knocked it down as prior development plans intended, the newly constructed building would have been substantially smaller in size, producing fewer units at the end of the day. That's not uncommon for historic buildings erected prior to modern zoning codes, but it was a critical part of the viability of keeping the building. The coordination between low-income housing credits and the historic design requirements makes initial design vastly more complicated. The city and state housing agencies have their own very extensive design requirements that are challenging enough to apply to an existing building, and making sure those play nicely with the historic requirements involved a lot of give and take and multiples appeals and redesigns across the agencies. At the end of the day, both the city and state agencies that we worked with were motivated as we were to get this project done and completed to provide affordable and supportive housing. And so that was really part of the key of navigating that process and getting through it. The historic credits provided a significant financial incentive and helped make the overall project feasible. While different in many respects from the low-income housing credits, the historic credits did dovetail pretty smoothly with the low-income credits, as we ended up using the same tax credit syndicator and investor, although there are different eligibility requirements for eligible basis and other lessons learned in some of the differences between them. It ended up being a pretty seamless blended funding source. And there was also a learning curve involved with the historic credits on our end, getting an initial understanding and level of comfort with the specific program requirements and how it differs from the low-income housing credits, which we were very used to. And even more so in the in-depth historic details and specifications required to pass muster with SHPO and the National Park Service. So I would say that having an experienced historic consultant and an architect who's familiar with the process and requirements is very important. I would certainly advise getting someone who knows the process well to help navigate through it. And there are so many details involved that working with a contractor up front is especially useful to try to get ahead of some of the issues as much as possible, to catalog and document the historic elements so that they can be incorporated in the plans at the front end. We ended up doing a lot of chasing of details later on. So I will wrap up by quickly flipping through the kind of before and after photos. So this is the historic corridors. Photoville added we worked with Photoville to add some art to the historic windows and door openings, which we've maintained on the typical floors. The balconies were incorporated into the apartments, keeping the same glazing. The curved windows at the ends also incorporated into the apartments. The historic 9th floor auditorium was retained, although it's not yet furnished. We're still working on that. The first floor historic library was converted into a computer room and library, but with the original details, and came out phenomenally well. And the basement kitchen is being put to use by Common Point Queens, keeping the original details, but using it for youth programs now, which is terrific. So the T building was a phenomenally interesting and challenging project, and I'm happy that I got to be a part of it. It was a great experience. Combining the historic renovation with affordable housing definitely adds complexity, but that is offset, in my opinion, by both the financial benefit of the historic credits and also by the pride of purpose in restoring and repurposing an important piece of history. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thanks, Mark. Really beautiful project. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks for also pointing out, I think, really important to emphasize the preservation of density, which doesn't get as much attention when we're talking about preserving the buildings themselves, but is really an important one to highlight. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A, and so I'm going to try to get through as many of these in the about 10 minutes that we have left for this panel. Christoph, you answered one in the Q&A, but I wanted to raise it if you could just kind of quickly answer this for everybody who's listening about the programmatic requirements that were suggested by the community for Randolph Houses. Just give us a quick overview of that.
Yeah. So the residents really want to see some after-school programming. They want to see something for their kids. They wanted to see some job training, some computer literacy. They wanted yoga space and workout space. So not in the building that I showed you, but in the building across the street, which is part, all three buildings are part of one community. They're managed by one management company. That building has a large community facility suite in the basement with light and air that addresses these needs. There's a yoga studio. There's programming from our local partner, West Harlem Group Assistance, and they have outside partners who provide programming or do some of that themselves. There's also, how do you access certain programs for the tenants? That's all part of that suite. Most development was developed with the tenant association with their input.
Great, thanks. So we have another question. For projects like this, did you have confidence in the existing architectural drawings, or did you have to commission a new set of as-built existing conditions drawings potentially using 3D laser scanning and BIM? So quick answers from either team.
So I can quickly jump. We weren't too worried about it because we took out all the interiors really. The biggest problem was the survey of the existing stairs, the elevations, to make sure that our new corridors would match the elevations, and obviously location of the stairs to make sure that our new corridor would bypass the existing vertical circulation. That was important. So we had a special survey done for that, but otherwise we didn't really worry too much about the existing plans for the apartments.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We try to get ahead of that, and it's a great idea to try to map what's there. We had a somewhat disastrous attempt at that by getting a laser surveyor in early on, and it was prior to demolition. So what they ended up measuring meant absolutely nothing, because they were measuring things that were not were plaster ceilings that were dropped and things that turned out to have nothing to do with the structure. So that was not entirely helpful. We did inherit from the hospital some good historic sets of plans, which were important, and we ended up getting a full set of historic plans that was really important in trying to track down some details. It didn't pick up every surprise, but it was certainly great, and obviously the more historic information you can get, the better.
Mark, while you're unmuted, quick question for you. How long did the T building project take from inception to residents moving in?
That would be 7 years, I guess, 8 years. I mean, in inception, the first 5 years, there was a lot of outreach to elected officials and to local stakeholders, and lots of public meetings, as I'm sure Trinity went through as well. So that's an important part of the process up front.
I was going to say both these projects had very long prehistories to get to the developers being able to even start.
Which is not uncommon for affordable housing in general, but here maybe even more protracted. Yeah.
Right, and in the case of the T building, there'd been numerous iterations. What I referred to, the architect had been working on various iterations that included demolition and all kinds of things for previous rounds of senior housing, of supportive housing. You'd gone through multiple turns to no avail. So it's often false starts.
And coincidentally, Saki and SLCE were the architects for Randolph Houses as well, and Mega was the contractor for Randolph Houses too. So,
great. Another question. There's often resistance to the creation of low-income and affordable housing from local residents in the communities where it's proposed. Did you find that preserving the historic look and feel of these structures helped to garner more support for the projects from local communities and elected officials? And a note, these case studies are very inspiring.
That's nice. I can jump in first. Yes, I think we definitely experienced that there was a committed group of preservationists in Queens and in the neighborhood who got very actively involved and had seen the building for years and had seen it sort of fade in its glory, and also heard about all these prior plans to demolish it. And so there was a very motivated group of people who was very helpful in getting it through and in overcoming some of the opposition that is always there to affordable housing.
I
And in the
don't
case of,
believe-
yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, we had an existing tenant population, so we had no resistance in that. We experienced that, Trinity experienced that in other developments, but certainly not at Randolph Houses.
Great, thanks. And then another question, what were some of the, in dealing with existing buildings, understanding kind of the structural systems that are there, dealing with abatement and, issues that you find in, when you start opening up older buildings. Can you talk a little bit more about, what you encountered as you got to know these buildings and, what complications that added to each, briefly, since we're running in our last couple of minutes.
I think a preservation project, if it's this specifically for housing, you assume the worst and hope for the best. I think, you'll find asbestos, you'll find PCBs, you'll find lead paint, you'll find mold, the powder post beetle. There's everything that there is, you'll have on your building, and you have to account for that even without looking at the details and opening up the walls. You have to be constantly flexible in addressing certain issues, structural issues. Mark pointed out his ceilings. We had similar issues with our walls. We had chimneys that couldn't support any joists, and you have to be flexible with that and have a contractor who understands that the flexibility is needed.
Yeah, it definitely adds challenges. I mean, after we have done mostly new construction, the vast majority of the work that we've done, and I would say that the rehab, tenant in place and gut rehab both make new construction look easy by comparison, which it's not. But so it definitely adds some challenges doing that.
I think we've answered all the questions in the Q&A. I have one additional one that I'd like to ask. So obviously now, having gone through these projects, working with the housing agencies that were involved and the preservation agencies, do you have suggestions or recommendations? You spoke a bit about some of the challenges and some of the conflicting goals and priorities and guidelines that come from the involvement of so many agencies, with often, if not necessarily purposely conflicting, but issues that come up that you have to sort of resolve. And do you have any suggestions kind of moving forward, were you to work on future projects or make recommendations to policymakers and the agencies about how to make the process maybe work a little more smoothly?
Affordable housing already is a regulated type of development, so you have due diligence there anyway. So I don't know, our experience was, yes, working with SHPO and NPS added a layer of complexity, but it's nothing unsolvable. It's just another piece of the puzzle, and I can't praise SHPO and NPS enough for really working with us and really supporting affordable housing. That cooperation has been a huge success, and I'm very grateful for their understanding and their input.
Yeah, I would echo what Christoph said, and I can't agree more. So we've had no idea, this is the first one we've done historic credits, and so we were terrified at the beginning of not knowing, do we have to save that tile? Do we have to save that light? Do we have to, what the parameters were? Because there aren't rules that are defined on this. It's more art than science on how it gets done. And so what we found is that they focused on the things that they cared about. They made clear what the priorities were on the historic side of what needed to be preserved. And they were definitely advocates for the project and definitely appreciated the conversion and appreciated the fact that it was being converted to affordable housing and that it was being reused. So I agree that they were terrific to work with, and in general were very rational and helpful in their process.
And I would just add to that from the historic point of view. I mean, the previous question about what do you uncover, what do you find, what are you expecting? That applies not just to affordable housing, but to any rehab of historic buildings. There are always surprises and the like. The tax credit is a rehabilitation tax credit, so it does build in some flexibility in terms of restoration versus rehabilitation. But that said, it is a historic preservation tax credit. So understanding all the different pieces, and then as Christoph and Mark both said, the overlay to the requirements of the affordable housing agencies, HPD and others, it definitely complicates things beyond the regular DOB requirements. But usually, if you're working with SHPO and coming into the project with some flexibility, as obviously Trinity did at Randolph Houses, and I think Dunn as well at the T building, you can get to a successful project.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful note to end our panel on. So I'd like to thank all three of our panelists for sharing these amazing projects with us. And I am going to turn it back, I think, to Frampton, or perhaps Vicky, or both, to introduce our second panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your participation, and to all our panelists. Hold on, I'm just going to stop the recording for a minute.